purpose of the Flick-Reedy Education Enterprises is to promote individual moral responsibility through education. How do we do this? We study and discuss the interrelationships of history, philosophy, social studies, and economics. We do not dictate. We do not make statements as to what we think you should or should not do. We do not unduly burden this program with footnotes, references, or complete documentation. However, we do give sufficient data to bring this discussion into proper focus. We invite you to delve further into the necessary historical and statistical data to develop a deeper understanding of truth and a keener sense of individual moral responsibility.
We have examined how communism appeals to the poor, the wealthy, and the intellectual. It paints a pretty picture of what communism claims it can do. But what about its record? What about some of its principles? Let's look at some of communism's teachings. First and foremost, communism is atheistic. It teaches there is no God. How strongly any person feels about his own spiritual faith will determine to what extent he or she finds communist atheism objectionable and incorrect. There are other things to consider, too. Remember our talking about dialectical materialism as being the logic of conflict that deals only with material things? It is the material things aspect that leaves me in doubt. Their logic, while fairly good, is based on the premise that consideration of material things should replace consideration of spiritual things. Material things over spiritual things. Is that a valid concept? Is that a true basic premise? Their logic runs something like this. They say, if you will permit me to say that 2 plus 2 equals 5 as my basic premise, then you will have to agree that 4 plus 4 equals 10, and that 8 plus 8 equals 20. So while their logic is okay, it's their premise they start with that is not true. And all their logic that follows leads to an untrue conclusion. Another fundamental of their logic's system is interpretation of history. They feel that by logical interpretation of history, they can predict the future and what will happen in the future. They start by analyzing that there have been always various classes of people in history, and that these classes were always in a struggle with one another. In the caveman society, the two struggling classes were the strong and the weak. Eventually, the strong subdued the weak. Thus began the perpetual class warfare concept. Next in history, they talk about the feudal society, where the lords and nobles dominated the serfs and slaves, continuing their concept of a constant class struggle which required changing. Now, under what they term the capitalistic era of society, there are the bourgeoisie, or property owners, taking advantage of the property-less workers, whom they call the proletariat. As before, they say the one exploits the other, with the lower class struggling and fighting to get ahead. Then they point to socialism as the intermediary stage to communism. Even under socialism, they describe the intellectuals who lord it over the masses. But in the final struggle that they say will evolve under communism, there will be no classes of people, but only the complete brotherhood of man. Did a couple of thoughts come to your mind in this recital of their logic of materialistic history? If this course of history is inevitable, if it has to happen, why are they working at it so hard? They say that while it would happen anyway, they want to speed up the process. Next, their idea of just two classes of people doesn't hold up. They completely disregard the broad spectrum of middle class in our capitalistic society. And this brings up another point. While caveman society, feudalism, socialism, and communism may be correct in terms of societies, capitalism is not a kind of society, but rather it is a kind of economic system. What or how would you describe our form of society? The closest I could come to it would be to call ours an individual freedom society. Remember their idea that man's actions and capabilities are only the result of his economic environment? They called it economic determinism, if you recall. Well, how about that? If that were true, how can they explain that while we here in the United States have only 6% of the world's population and but 7% of the land area of the world and do not have a disproportionate share of the Earth's natural resources, then how come we have more than 50% of the world's goods? Why have we never had a famine? It kind of shoots a hole in their theory, doesn't it? Here is one of their greatest deceptions. To achieve this complete brotherhood of man they talk about, they say,
from each according to his ability, and to each according to his need.
Sure, sounds good, doesn't it? What's wrong with it? What they don't tell you is who is to decide these two questions. And the answer is that the communist bosses do the deciding. They will decide what your ability is, and they will decide what your need is. You have nothing to say about it. That makes it sound a little different, doesn't it? It's their communist socialist intelligentsia who make those decisions affecting you and me, the masses. There is no use worrying. It won't do you any good. It's like being in one of our jails. They take care of you, but you do not have any choices about anything. Fact is that people in our jails are fed better, clothed better, and are more comfortable than most of their people who are not in jail. The Siberia is hardly a choice spot for travel or vacation. No study of communism, even so quick a study as we have shared together, would be complete without the inclusion of material on the Communist Manifesto. This is the basic book from which their philosophy, strategy, and tactics are obtained. It is from this book that Lenin developed his plans for world conquest. The Communist Manifesto was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, although Marx seems to get most of the credit for it. It was published in 1848, only a little more than a century ago. It didn't cause much to happen until Lenin worked at it about the turn of the 20th century, 1900. It is a rather small book, only 82 pages in the copy now available in paperback form. If we are to have a complete picture of communism, we must read this basic text. What we cover in the next few minutes can only be some of the highlights. Let's start with some of the steps it says are necessary to reach the ultimate goals. Abolition of private property. Marx considered that only the ruling class owned property, that the workers had none. His idea was that no one should own any property, that it should all belong to the state. And how does he say he hopes to accomplish that? A few paragraphs earlier, he had this to say.
The immediate aim of the Communists is the same as that of all the other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat.
Next, Marx would have the abolition of the family. I hope this sentence will whet your appetite to read this section of the manifesto in full. He states,
The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting.
And finally, Marx would have abolition of nationality. He says,
Working men have no country. We cannot take away from them what they have not got.
Shortly before Marx gives his 10-point platform for economic action, he again talks about how this will be achieved. He says,
We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat, workers, to the position of the ruling class, to win the battle for democracy.
Then he continues,
The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, property owners, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat, organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible.
That's not all. Listen to this.
Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production.
Now I believe we're ready to hear his 10-point program, which is as follows, and should by this time not come as much of a surprise to you. He says,
1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3. Abolition of all right of inheritance. 4. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8. Equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of population over the country. 10. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc.
Now, what better formula could you possibly put together for gaining absolute power over everyone than this by Marx and Engels? If we could put this formula into effect, we could obtain and keep total power over any society. Once in control, only a bloody revolution could throw us out. The above knowledge has prompted two quotations which merit your consideration. First,
the Marxist ideology is a weapon of conspirators and a philosophy for fools.
And second,
communism operates under two imperatives. It must come to power by deception. It must remain in power by force. The only effective answer to deception is knowledge.
in support of these quotations, can you recall any time or place where communism has become the national power by the voluntary acceptance of even a majority of the people? Can you think of any time or place where communism, once entrenched, has been replaced by any other form of government without the use of force and bloodshed? Lenin has been quoted as saying,
"The ruling class will never surrender its power voluntarily."
Of course, he's talking about the bourgeoisie property owners. But I suggest that never has a ruling class had such complete power and been so ruthless in the exercise of that power as the ruling class of the Communist Party. Is it somehow going to be so different that they would relinquish their power voluntarily? Do you really think that the self-appointed intelligentsia, which intends to rule over the masses in the name of socialism, will ever give up that power voluntarily if and when it succeeds in getting it? Just a thought or two more. It's been suggested that because the Communist Party of Russia has had some differences of opinion with the Communist parties of Yugoslavia and more recently Red China, that the goal by Lenin of world conquest has been abandoned. I suggest that it's a little bit like a squabble within your own family. No one in the family will join an outsider against a member of the family. We will patch up our quarrel until after we lick the outsider, then perhaps begin quarreling among ourselves again. Have you ever seen or heard any one of the communist countries siding with a non-communist country? Even when Khrushchev denounced Stalin for the first time, he said to the non-communist countries,
"Don't misinterpret our actions. Don't think for a moment that this means we have abandoned the teachings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Anyone who waits for that to happen must wait until shrimps learn to whistle."
And finally, we must talk about the perversion of language as a tool of the communists. How fervently all of us want peace, want the end of war if at all possible. Yet time after time the communists say they are for peace, world peace. It sounds good, until we find out what the communist definition of peace is. It goes something like this.
Peace is that condition and time when all resistance to communism has ceased.
I guess they have a right to define words any way they want to. But it becomes very necessary for each of us to know how to translate what they say into words for which we understand the meaning. We've touched on a few of the highlights in this brief time together. I hope you will see fit to go further into this study. I believe sincerely that the material I have shared with you is factual and presented in the right order, and that nothing was left out that would tend to change the meaning of anything that was included. But don't take my word for it. You owe it to yourself, your children, and your grandchildren to verify it yourself. It's that important. For only by understanding together can we successfully protect our precious freedom.